Hi, George.
Hey, George, it's Johnny.
Hey George, how you doing, buddy?
Hi, George.
How you doing, George?
Hi, George.
George, how you doing?
Hi, George.
Hi, George. How you doing?
Hi, George.
Hey George, how you doing?
Hi George.
Hey George, we miss you. I'm not going to tell all these stories. I might have to use them against you one of these days, so I'm going to save some of them for better times.
So I got your granddaughters out here. They have a little chat with them, and so we're going to reminisce a little bit.
Now, your granddaughters have got me sitting here, and I was telling them, I'm more nervous to talk to you like this than I was when I was reporting to you in the boardroom. So let's just get that out on the table, George. I am a little nervous sitting here. They're going to ask me some questions, and I'm going to tell them how much you meant to me, George.
George had a lot of friends, and
You became a good friend.
And I'm glad to consider you as a friend.
He always took the time to talk to me.
George was always there to listen.
George is one of a kind, and I feel very fortunate to call him a friend.
No, we've been good friends for a long time, and I've appreciated his friendship.
Friends with my grandpa, and then friends with my dad, and ultimately friends with me. It's been a multi-generational friendship. Proud to be part of it.
He was a giant in our industry. I mean,
You know, he worked my ass off. George was you're a hard guy, but that's what made him great too. Right?
He set the role model for other managers.
Because he was Magi, and he ran it like it was his own personal outfit, and that's why it was successful.
But I admired you. You were a role model. You were somebody I could go to when I had questions, and I always knew I could trust your answer.
But everyone respected George because of no one outworked George, right? And so he led by example.
Real pioneers of the industry, to be honest.
By inspiration to me and a teacher.
Field that I really looked up to.
I mean, most people would have just gave up, not even tried, but not George.
I think every time I was around him, I learned something.
I have known George for my entire life. He was friends with my grandpa, and then friends with my dad, and ultimately friends with me. It's been a multi-generational friendship. Proud to be part of it.
Well, I guess as an adult, when I really met him was the first time I went to go work for him. Oh shoot, that was 4 years ago now? Something like that?
Well, I've worked for Cranes for 19 years, and I think the first 5 years I was so afraid to approach George that I you know, didn't know him at all, and then finally I got the guts enough to talk to him one day and realized that he was a really good guy. And after that, I started waving to him, and it took a while, and then finally he started waving back, and so we kind of developed a relationship from that point. So I'd say I've known him about 14 years pretty well.
Well, professionally, I met him when I came back to work at the warehouse. But when I was a little kid, we were doing fundraising. George ran Magi. And there was a reason why Magi had low packing charges and was very successful. George only spent what he had to spend. And I was this ambitious young kid, and I can't remember what I was selling. I think they were little chocolate bars or something, and trying to raise some money. And I was making up a list who I should go see, and I was categorizing it by business. And I had written down, Magi, and I think it was Trudy Gamble maybe, or my mom. One of them said, I don't know if you should go ask George. I don't think he's going to give you any money. So that was actually my first experience, and I remember it to this day. But professionally, I met George when I came back from Gonzaga, and I was tasked with running the warehouse. And George had helped our family through a tough time, was the receiver for us. And when I got back to the warehouse, he had righted the ship and was a member of our company's board. And I came into the operation and got to meet him in that relationship.
I bought an orchard in 1974, and the people that owned the orchard that I bought had been taking their fruit to Magi. So we became friends that way. That was the year they put the pre-sizer in the Magi building, and that's when I met George, and we've been friends ever since.
You asked about how we met. I remember meeting you for the first time when I went in for an interview, for the sales job, which I had no experience in. I was just a dumb farmer, and I had been working. Of course, we had the orchard and went to work as a warehouseman at Wilbur Ellis there just to kind of make some extra money. And then I heard about the opening there and came in, and we went out to lunch and met you for the first time, and ended up that you gave me the job and gave me that opportunity, and I really appreciate that. And so as you know, that kind of where it ended up where I'm at now, 25 years later or so, doing the same thing, and I appreciate it. It's been a good living for me, and you gave me that opportunity.
I probably first met or knew him when I was back in the 60s when Bill Meadows had the Shell station. He had fruit stands across the road. And then I got to know him a little more in the 70s when I had the Coral. They used to come in, him and friends of his and stuff, and I got to know those guys a little bit then.
Oh gosh, I've known George, probably met him first about shortly after he came to work for Magi in the late 60s, after the freeze. And I remember him coming out with Dad and I riding around the Jeep, evaluating trees that were dead, alive, maybe grow. We mapped the whole damn orchard, the three of us. So that was kind of my first experience with George. I always knew he was kind of tough and serious and on the job all the time. That was my first experience with George. So he was kind of the person you were kind of quiet around because you never knew what to say because it was work, work, work.
Yeah, actually I met George when I was about 7 or 8, walking up from the school from 7th Street at their old house there where they had the gravel yard. And we were dinking around there and in the yard, and George came out and told us to get the heck out of that yard right now. And I thought, whoa, I'm scared of that guy. And so I've always been just a little bit scared of George because that first imprint when I was a kid. And I told George that story. We laughed about it 100 times. I had no idea who George was, but that's the first time I met him. But actually after that, I was a teenager and I met George. I was loading apples at one of our bin piles, and your Uncle Mike was driving one of the straddle trucks, and George came out and we visited, and he kind of officially, I kind of got to know him at that point. I was probably a teenager.
I still remember when I graduated from WSU in the spring of 1985, and Jeff Heath was working for you at that time. He was the head of field staff, and I'd sent a few resumes out, and lo and behold, I got a call from you and Jeff to interview. And I was so nervous. We met up at Cedars up in Okanagan. That was George's hangout for a number of years. But anyway, I didn't know that then, but I knew it afterwards. So anyway, we met up there, and anyway, come to find out, I'd be danged if I didn't get the job. And so I started working for George, and as a fieldman, young fieldman, and I still remember, I was happy to get the job, and it was on par with everything else, but I started for $1,100 a month. So that shows how times have changed a little bit, or it shows how old I am, one or the other.
These guys said they want me to recollect our various contacts through the history of this apple industry. Started out, I suppose, when Mike played on my Little League team. Back in the day, I think Frank Fulford and my dad were coaching, and Spud was a big grown-up guy, kind of a stud, and I could pitch pretty well and this and that. And Mikey played for us, and I remember him telling my dad, I will go stand up there at the plate, but I'm not going to bat. And it took my dad a little while to figure out that Mike meant he wasn't going to swing. And he basically walked every at bat all season long. So he was always on base. It was actually one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen. He had enough brains not to swing at stuff over his head and outside like all kids do. So that was impressive.
Well, I guess it probably back in college. I was in a senior econ class, and sitting next in the front row, and sitting next to me was this smart ass. And I didn't know who he was because he argued with the professor every single day. It was just a constant. The thing that was unique about it was George was right and the professor was wrong. And the professor didn't like that at all. So anyway, that was my first experience at really spending any time with him. It turned out okay because the professor felt sorry for me and gave me an A, and George didn't get an A, which really ticked him off. But that's where it started.
Well, the first one I can really recall, we moved to Brewster down here and bought the station in August of 1970. And of course, Magi was across the street. I'd met George, just nothing personal at that point. And then one day during harvest, he comes across the street in the midday, and he says, "You look like you used some business." And we were really struggling. I mean, it was, terrible. And I said, "Yeah, sure, what do you need?" And he says, "You can service this straddle truck if you want to." Well, Magi had one straddle truck, and Apple House had one straddle truck, and to my knowledge, that was probably the only two in the valley. So anyway, I said, "Sure, I'd love to do that." He says, "Okay, I'll have it in here at 11 o'clock tonight." Well, our hours were 7 in the morning till 8 at night, but I went up at 11 o'clock at night. Clarence Hogan was driving it. He pulled it in, I serviced it, I changed the oil and lubed it, and George, your dad, or your grandfather, and Clarence fixed all the lights and weren't working and everything, and midnight or 12:30, Clarence took off to work the rest of the night, I guess. So that was the first real business engagement I had with him. And probably without George and Stan Gorey and Spider Rig and the business that they give us from their businesses, we probably wouldn't have made it the first year. So, pretty big deal.
One that sticks out in my mind, 2018, when George went to Hawaii, he left me in charge of not only his ranch, but also his house, which Allie was staying in at the time, and most importantly, his payroll, which to be left in charge of George Chapman's payroll, I took as quite an honor. In fact, well, when I was doing his payroll, before I wrote in the ledger, because it's all handwritten ledgers, I would do it on a scratch sheet on the side to make sure that I didn't get anything wrong in George's ledger, because I knew George would catch that. The only time I've ever spilled a bin of fruit off the back of a tractor in my entire life was working harvest 2017, 2018 for George. Driving the last bin out for the day a little fast, and looked back just as the bin tipped up, and right behind the bin happened to be George on the four-wheeler. Watched the whole thing happen. Only time in my entire life I've ever tipped a bin off the forks of a tractor. Happened to be in George's orchard right in front of him. Felt pretty foolish that day. Luckily he took it in stride. We filled it back up and took it back to the shop. I have the job I have now because of George, really. I was, became clear that I wasn't going to be able to support my family working on this small ranch, and it was time to go looking for another job. And I was starting to put resumes out in the industry, and George says, hey, I've got a friend that owns an Arrowhead orchard in Bridgeport that I know was looking for some help at one point, and why don't you give them a call? And so on George's advice I did, and I got a job there, pretty good job, as the irrigation supervisor. That was in 2018. Now it's 2021, and I'm the operations manager there. I'm one of the top people. So without George's recommendation, I may not be there now. So I appreciate that, George. Having your recommendation really helped a lot with your old friend Doug.
Well, the first day I went to go out there, I was extremely nervous because I heard all these stories about George Chapman and how hard-ass he was. And then the first thing I do, we get there and we get in his truck and we drive around, shows me his orchard. And he was nice, funny. He wasn't the hard-ass I was expecting. And I think I sprayed was the first thing I did for him, so he wanted to show me all the valves so I wouldn't hit the valves. And he showed me where all the flags are, where each tank should come out perfect. If it's not, there's an issue there. There's part of the hard ass right there, but he was never like that. He was always enjoyable to work with and wanted to teach you if you did things wrong. But luckily I didn't do many things wrong. Well, he was good at teaching Blake, I guess talking to him when he'd do something incorrect, or because at that age you don't know how people want things done. And then he would explain it, because I remember the first year Blake worked out there, he was kind of a young knucklehead, and then compared to the next year he worked out there, it was the growth. You could see the growth. He was working more as like a man and harder than some of the guys out there working than he was years prior. And I think George is a big influence on that.
Well, he's actually told me a lot of stories that George is gotta be the toughest guy that I know mentally, and physically probably too. But he told me about one time he was in the military. He was on an aircraft carrier, and he was working the night shift. And he said when they got done working on aircraft, they liked to fire him up and just double check and make sure everything was okay. And he said one night they got done working on the aircraft, and his partner and he said, okay, let's go ahead and fire it up. So George said he got up in the cockpit and fired up the aircraft and ran it up to full RPM. And he said next thing he noticed out of the corner of his eye, his buddy was kind of going like that. And George was thinking, oh no, it doesn't seem like the gauges all look normal. He didn't notice anything wrong mechanically. And when he got down to the aircraft carrier, the captain of the ship was taking a nap in a hammock behind the ship, and when they ran it up to full power, he blew the guy out of his hammock. And George said they technically weren't supposed to fire up the aircraft after about 8 p.m., but they didn't like to sign him off as good to go unless they checked him out. And he said for quite a while that guy gave him a hard time. He called him up to officer's cabin and let him have it that night. And then he said every time he'd pass him in the hallway, the guy would give him a dirty look and kind of, you know, he was really worried that that guy was gonna, you know, really get him in trouble for doing that. But I thought that was that was pretty interesting. George has a lot of interesting stories. I can remember one of the last pear crops that George picked. He did. It was a rough year. I think it was 18. It was a rough year, and George was frustrated because he had start out. I think he had 8 pickers, and by a few hours into it, or even if that, they may not have even started. A couple quit because they wanted him to pay him more, and a couple of them quit. So finally, he decided to pay him $1 more than what he had told him, but they needed to clean up the bins a little bit, and he met me about the end of the day. I pulled in to ask him how it was going, and he told me that that it wasn't going very well. They weren't getting any of the bins cleaned up at all, and he was paying them $1 more, and he was about ready to have me come pick the bins and just give them to me for nothing because he was so tired of dealing with those guys. I remember when he first got Kobe, he told me he never had any that I knew of. He never had any pets or anything. After Kobe got ran over and broke his leg, I can remember George stopped me one night down there by our block orchard. He was driving out and I was driving in, and he said, you know, all those years that I traveled and you know, worked and everything, I always looked at people who had dogs, and I thought, you know, it just seems like a lot of work, a lot of extra work, and kind of expensive. And then he paused for a second and he looked at me and he said, you know, I was right. Right, this was right after he got Kobe's leg fixed. But I watched him and Kobe become friends, and pretty soon I noticed a few scratches on George's truck, and I was waiting for him to, you know, complain to me about that, but he never did. And now they're just the best of friends. And there's no limits with those two. He told me when they were working on the fruit stand down at the terrace, which I could never think of anybody telling George no, you know, that they wouldn't loan him any money. But anyway, he was building a fruit stand down at the terrace, and went to the Bank of Commerce in town. He had to borrow about, I thought, $700 or $800 about. And he went into the bank and they said, no, we can't do that. And he said, well, I'd already got the lumber and done the work. So he said he had to go over to Alice Grover and tell her, well, I'll pay you when I can. But I don't know that it was that year, but I think the very next year, that fruit stand, I think he told me he made $28,000 in a season. And of course, he said that was a lot of money back then, which you could imagine. But boy, the tables turned, didn't they, as he kept working hard. And everybody was going to him to borrow money.
So, on a serious note, the impact George had on me was really instilling a culture of discipline. George, you know, he was friendly to me, but before we ever got to any kind of friendly talk, he always asked me how my costs were in the warehouse. And he didn't just stop with, you know, how's your costs? Oh, they're good, George. He'd say, well, what are you paying for a box top today? What are you paying for a bottom? What about them layer pads? And he really, what he was doing is he was making sure that I was looking at everything like he would have looked at everything. And so it kept me on my toes. I always wanted to know every detail, because quite frankly, when I would go to the boardroom, I knew, you know, my dad was there and my Uncle Cass, and there was a number of other people there. But I knew the only guy in the room that knew anything about a warehouse was George. And so I was supposed to come in and give my report. And I knew I'm just reporting to George, because I could say anything and the rest of these guys wouldn't know if it's good or bad. But to George, you knew. And so I had to be very accurate, and you told me when it was good, and I could tell when it wasn't. And I left that boardroom, George, And all I could do was go figure out how to correct it so that I would get your blessing.
We were birds of a feather in a lot of ways. So when we went to his 80th birthday deal, I didn't talk because I didn't have anything that I thought was printable.
Sounds.
But when he turned 50, I think it was, I put an ad in the Quad City Herald, a picture of him in his Navy uniform. And I wrote, "Who'da thunk it?" George had a lot of friends and a lot of people that he did business with. And I came into this town not knowing anyone and no intention on living here. I just bought the orchard as an investment. I didn't ever plan on living up here, but when I got into a divorce situation, I had to have a place to go, and I had a house on the orchard that was just downriver from his orchard.
Well, one thing I do remember, George, is as far as I want to get that coin from you that you used to flip for lunch. Fucking coin. I never could figure out how you always won. And I never could figure out why you never hardly ever bought lunch. You tight ass. No, that was all good. I do remember when there was one time when I'd been working at Magi for maybe a year, and I went out to the line and I was looking at the fruit, and I had a customer coming that I wanted to impress, and I went out to the line, and the reds we were packing were supposed to be premium, and they didn't look so premium. So I went up to your office and I knocked on the door and I came in and I said, "George, you got a second?" And he said, "Yeah, come on in. You were at your desk." And I said, "George," I said, what they're packing out there just doesn't look that great. And got a customer coming. He just kind of looked at me and he said, "Sterl, close the door behind you when you leave." So that gave me the lesson that, salespeople belong in the sales office, and you let the packers do their job and the operations do their job, and let the sales guys do what they're supposed to do. And but I do have to say, the next day you came by and you walked by the sales office, and you looked over at me and you said, "Sterl, maybe that was a little wrong out there." And that's all you said, and you kept on walking. But that was, it was good. We've already talked about the trips. We took a couple trips together and how much I enjoyed that, and actually came up yesterday again, and that was good. It was just good to have your company. It was good conversation, and I was comfortable being around you. Later on when I was working, and I went through a couple issues and family issues, and George was always there to listen.
Well, I know that him and, what was the guy, his buddy there, they used to get in a lot of little mischief and stuff, but I think they made up for it since. George has been, done a lot for a lot of the Hispanic community and done a lot of good things around. One of the things that I remember is I was pitching about something, and he says, I don't remember what the conversation was, But he says, maybe you have too many things. And I thought, what's he talking about? And I forgot he'd been here at a birthday party I had and saw the shop, and I think that's what he probably figured. Another thing that I always remember about him that really sticks with me, I was complaining about paying income tax. He looked at me and he says, there's a lot worse things than having to pay income tax. I said, yeah, like being broke. I've been there a bunch of times. But mostly it's his intelligence and that you really like. He just seems to be able to cut right to the chase, and he understands all facts of life. He's interesting. Yeah, he's really, and he listens when he talks. When he talks to you, you listen to him, and when you talk, he does listen to you. It doesn't wander off or pay it. He always pays attention, like he is interested. Very good quality. We used to go down to every once in a while we'd swing down and go shopping with him at the Walmart. We'd go over to the Apple Cup, and we always had good, interesting conversation. But most of them are just good visits,
Well, I grew up in Bridgeport. He's from Batera, so we've always been in the produce business together, ran warehouses and orchards, and we've known so many characters. But I think one of the things that sets your dad apart from most of the people I know is the fact that he's the only person I know that ever tried to change a mower blade while it was running. And he's done a few other doofball things in his life too, but he's unique. I know a lot of people in this industry, have for years, but he probably stands out as being one of the characters. I don't think he even remembers, but actually I think the first time I ever saw, I remember it in college, but ever saw him was my wife and I grew up going to the log church, and Alberta we had this Bible study, and she had it at her house one Sunday night, and they lived down, it was somewhere down like that part of town. We went there, and I remember we had the Bible study. George went in the other room, of course. But yeah, that was the first time I ever saw him. But we, growing up here and just know everybody in the industry that he knows, and he knows everybody that I know, and so it's been an interesting journey, and we probably talk at least once a week forever. But Jim knows how he'll repeat himself on the same sentence. He does that. It's like, well, I went down there. It's like I heard it the first time. We're both history buffs, and of course been in the both were in the Navy, and if you put 10 books out on this table from my books or 10 of his, probably 7 of them would be World War II books. Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, Roosevelt, Stalin, and we just would read them over and over. So I looked at his books over there, and I've got almost every one he's got. Most people, I think, they just see the one side of him. He does, first answer is usually no. If you ask him something, I want to take a trip, I want to do this, no, I don't think, and then as time goes on and he thinks about it, then he usually changes his mind. He's a unique guy. I don't know anybody like him.
But anyway, so I worked for George for a couple of years, and learning the ropes, and of course, I had Jeff there, and so Jeff was a great mentor, in the field. But I always would go to George's office after hours or before, and always picking George's brain about this and that. And one of the things I always appreciate about George was he always took the time to talk to me, and so it was great. And in those conversations, I learned a lot. And so anyway, we did that for a couple of years, and then My other first with George was after a couple of years, I got a job offer at Custom. And I left and went to be the assistant manager at Custom Apple Packers. And then I did the 1987 crop there at Custom. And the 1987 crop was like the biggest crop Magi ever had. And George, I don't know if he didn't have an ops guy or had problems with his current ops guy or whatever, but I'll still never forget the spring of '88. George called me up and said, hey, we need to talk. So we went down there, and it was below his pear orchard in that little golden block he had there, and we both sat on the grass. It was about this time of year, a little bit of green grass coming up. We sat down there and bullshitted for a while. And he said he needed an ops guy and wanted to know if I would be interested in that job. And, you know, I'd only been doing field work for 2 years, but I just thought, you know, that opportunity would be good, and if I could learn under George, that'd be great. And so anyway, I did it. And, you know, and then our relationship really got close, and we worked together every day. You know, he worked my ass off. George was you're a hard guy, but that's what made him great too, right? And everyone there would, you know, would be tough on George, but everyone respected George because of no one outworked George, right? And so he led by example. But I spent even more time with him, you know, before work and after work, and asking questions and this and that. And then we'd start, you know, we'd go down to the cafe, and he'd start drawing a P&L on the back of a napkin or a balance sheet, and, you know, show me what working capital was, and, you know, all these different, you know, financial things that, you know, he just had in the top of his head. But a lot of that stuff stuck with me forever. And a lot of people today will say that I'm pretty good at that kind of stuff. And so, you know, those moments were great. Then I left Magi after a number of years because I had another opportunity, and I was getting kind of tired of doing the operations because it was, you know, 16 hours a day I think I did it for 7 years. And it was a lot of work, and honestly, George will probably laugh when he hears this, but I thought, well, if I stay there, George is going to stay there forever, you know. And but anyway, I left, and I don't know if it was the right thing to do or not, but I did. I left and went to Wilbur Ellis, did field work, and then I think it was the spring of '91 or something like that. George called up and said, "Hey, let's visit. I think I'm about ready to retire and see if you want to do this thing." So there's another first with George, right? So so then he mentored me for a year or two to, you know, to take his spot. And then we really, you know, spent a lot of time together, and we're working more on the financial pieces and you know, the thing about George, critical thinking, you know, and I think a lot of that's missing today, you know, and I think that I learned a lot from him on, you know, how to be a critical thinker and how to think things through. And so I'll always appreciate that about him. And so then, you know, when I became the manager, I mean, we kind of lost touch with each other, which is unfortunate. And I always regret that, and I still, you know, regret that. And you know, I feel bad that we haven't seen more of each other, because I always had a ton of respect for George. We didn't have a lot of fun stuff with George. It was mostly work. But I do remember, like, one really cool thing that George did for Dana and I is it was the fall of '89, which was the second biggest crop ever in the state after '87. And I'd been working my ass off down there, and he knew it. And that was when Treetop was having trouble. And he was spending all of his time at Treetop, and basically I was running the warehouse because he was at Treetop all the time, and it was harvest. And well, anyway, he had to fly down to Treetop for a meeting, some special meeting, and the plane was flying into the airport here. And he said, "Why don't you and Dana fly down there, you know, to Yakima with me tonight, and you can, you know, hang out or go have dinner or whatever. And so anyway, I called one of my college buddies back then, and he met us at the airport. And we went out for dinner, and but I'll never forget, because it was '89 and we'd already had the warehouse completely full. Okay, the warehouse was completely full. We were stacking. We figured we had about 6,000 or 8,000 bins on the outside of Plant 1, between Plant 1 and Plant 2. And it was all orchard run fruit ready to be packed. But I mean, you couldn't hardly even pull a truck in there. And when we flew out off the airport over to Brewster to head to Yakima, we flew over that massive pile of bins. And I went, oh my gosh, we're in deep trouble, you know. But, you know, we worked our way through it, and it was just a great night for Dana and I, because it was a big deal for us back then to fly on a plane. I'd never, you know, gone on a last second excursion like that, and be able to fly to a different town, just have dinner, and then fly back that same night, you know. So it was a big deal that I'll, you know, never forget. And you know, we had, like I said, a lot of time, coffee at Lindsay's, you know. I mean, George always liked to visit and strategize about things, you know, over a cup of coffee. And whether it was over at Bob's or up at Cedars Inn or something like that, it was always a time where he liked to really kick things around and think about stuff. So, like I said, I learned a ton from him at that time.
Dad and George were good friends for a long time, and through that relationship, I got to know George, having coffee in the mornings, breakfast. We used to have breakfast every morning together. So I get to know him that way, and then I was on the board at Magi in '88 through the rest of his time as manager. So I got to know George even more through that. And one thing I always admired about George on the board was that he would take the most complicated situation that came up and break it down to its simple parts and make it very understandable. I always appreciated that. You know, some people that are intelligent will take a complicated idea and leave it complicated and confuse the hell out of people. Not George. He can break it down to its simple parts, which made it really nice. You never left a board meeting without understanding what was going on and what George had in mind. And then through Magi and all the different mergers we went through back in the 80s and early 90s. So that was really interesting. I do know some personal stories about George. Most of them I can't tell you. Well, actually, I worked for George in '86 when he was, excuse me, he was manager of Magi. They fired the treetop manager. He managed treetop through the ALAR scandal back in Washington, D.C., getting help from the federal government. And let's see, treetop, Magi, what else? He was doing 3 things. I can't think of the third one right now. George would cuss me when he sees this because he'll say, I'll tell you what the third thing was. But, and then George and I got to be closer friends. And like I say, I worked for him for a year while he was busy with all of that other stuff, flying to DC with Ed Parasol. And there's some stories there that are interesting that I won't go into either. But there's some other good stories about that when he was running Brewster Heights and trying to help them get out of trouble, but I can't tell those either because they were told in confidence. '68 when the bridge burnt right before pear harvest and apple harvest, which really screwed things up because all the straddle tracks had to go to Bridgeport and around to the other side. So we had a little flotilla in here. Breakers had a boat in here, George, Cranes, Kirks, and maybe others. So every night, every day, they parked their cars over here and they all boated across for, gosh, some of them 2 years. It took 2 years to get the new bridge built. No, we've been good friends for a long time, and I've appreciated his friendship. It's been good. It gave me an incentive to, when I didn't feel like working sometimes, to know that George was. And that you know, it doesn't hurt anybody to have that incentive. Oh, I just want to tell about when last fall we broke a tractor and George was finished, so I borrowed one of his tractors, and I know how he takes care of them. I mean, they got to be clean every night, basically. So after we got done with that tractor, I washed it, I waxed it, I even did whatever special treatment on all the plastic, so when I went back, it looked brand new. George was kind of like shocked when I brought it back, but well, I always learned from my dad, if you borrow something, take it back in at least as good or better condition than when you got it. Change the oil, change all the filters, because I appreciate him letting me use it. I mean, if I had to rent a tractor, it would have cost me a lot of money, but knowing it was going back to Georgia, it had to look good. And it did. It must have been that old military thing. If it doesn't work, paint it anyway. Make it look good. Anyway, I hope you're happy with the way the tractor came back, George. Hey, by the way, I need to borrow a tractor.
Well, that was the first time I ever washed a tractor, was working for George Chapman. We finished spraying, and he told me to go down to, go down and wash the tractor. At first I thought he was joking, and then I recalled my brother Eric told me that he had to wash George's tractors after spraying for him. And luckily I never had to wax a tractor, but some mornings you get there and you'd be like, wow, tractor looks great. George goes, yeah, I had to wax the hood. It was driving me nuts. And then, you know what, George? Then we started washing our tractors here. Usually just with the pressure washer, not soap and water, but it depends on how dirty they are. See, there's more influence right there.
Next thing I probably kind of remember is when I rented Blaine Madden's Bisbee orchard over out of Bridgeport and had no warehouse to take the fruit to, and Brewster Heights was over full and you were over full and you were stacking fruit outside. And I came inside and said, I've got a couple thousand bins of crappy Bisbees that don't have a home, and you said, well, bring them on in, we'll handle them, and you did really well with them. It was kind of a lifesaver for me. I was just getting going, I hadn't been out of college very long, and I was getting started trying to farm. And then probably the next, I realized all the stuff about saving treetop and this and that, but the next thing I really remember is when our family got completely upside down, and we were going into receivership or probably bankruptcy or whatever, and you let Peter Crane and my brother or somebody talk you into coming and working to help us get out of that thing. I can't believe you did that. But anyway, the most impressive thing is when you told Ed Paraso not to come into work the next day. And I was kind of wondering how that was all going to work out, but it worked out actually amazingly well. You helped turn our company around and probably saved us from going through some kind of a massive meltdown, and helped Johnny learn how to operate, Dan Paraso and him, how to operate a warehouse more efficiently, and kind of saved us. And then when you were on our board, I'm probably the opposite of Johnny. I never had an answer for why it cost me so much to plant orchards or what we were doing, but I tell you, I'm putting the right varieties in to the best of my ability and this and that, and you usually would say that's probably a good idea, even though we were always nearly underwater doing it, which was how I've operated my whole career. By the way, I actually have some money in the bank. Cass and I hit a lick in cherries last year. Can you believe it, George? I have a positive loan balance in Mac and Cass and a couple other of my entities. It's actually fascinating. I've never been in that position. Anyway, I haven't.
Oh man, I mean, George was like a great pinch hitter that came into our business, 20 years ago, and we were struggling, and we were in the process of working out a deal with the Parasos to redeem our partnership interest with them, and we were flat ass broke, and the banks were riding us, and we went with my dad and my sister Jody and Peter, and we went and asked George if he would come in and help us get this deal turned around. He had just recently retired from the co-op, and he was available, and we thought there wasn't a chance in heck, and we had a great visit with George in his living room, And he said, hey, I'm going to do this. Let's do this thing. Let's get it done. You guys are important to the community. I really like this community. Lived here most of my adult life, and let's get this thing done. And George came in, and he was wonderful. I mean, we became very good friends at that point. The thing about George is he was a no-nonsense person, and people would, like, my first impression as a little kid is, whoa, you know, that guy's mean, man. I'm not getting on the wrong side of him. George was a teddy bear, man. He had a good sense of humor and a kind of a dry wit. And he always had me laughing about little things I wasn't thinking about. And that just kept the relationship we had over these 20 years where he helped us at Gebers Farms. It kept it very normal. And you didn't know that about him until you really got to know him. So I appreciated that too.
Well, I think we ought to get into a little humor here, because there was a lot of years that people didn't think there was much humor in his life. But there really was. A couple things come to me as I was thinking about it. There was one time that his insurance agents, Daryl Ferguson and I think Daryl's boss were over there, and they were negotiating their warehouse insurance policy. And George had come across the street and got a pack of cigarettes or gum and told me what was going on. Well, when they were leaving the office, there was a pile of bins there, and a gust of wind come up and blew a bin off of that bin pile, and it bounced off of Daryl's brand new Blazer onto the hood of the other guy's brand new Volvo station wagon. And I thought, well, it's a good thing your negotiations are over. Anyway, and then well, there's several here. I'll just give you a couple. George bought the lot behind the station from Virginia Saul. And he come across the street and he said, if you want any of this, now's the time to buy it. I'll let you have so much of it. So anyway, I bought some of it, and Magi bought it. And we went down to Tom Binner's office to do the paperwork. So there's Jenny Saul and George and myself in there, and Tom Binner, and George tells Tom what we need, and Tom says, well, that doesn't look too complicated to me. And George just looks straight at Tom and says, well, if it was any complicated, we wouldn't be in your office. There was a time when I was opening the station one morning, and Sterl Divis was managing Wilbur Ellis. And Sterl stopped in to get a can of chew, and we looked across the street and there was smoke coming out of the warehouse. So anyway, I said, Sterl, that looks like smoke. And he ran over there and climbed up the bin pile, and there were the rafters in the roof were starting to burn, and I think they tarred the roof or something the day before. And I called the fire department. So anyway, they got the fire out before there was too much damage or anything, and Sterl and I were walking around pretty big because we think we're going to get a thank you from George. So Sterl, he stops for lunch and he said, George, come over? And I said, nope, haven't seen him. So I don't know, probably a week goes by, and George comes over, and I said, George, I said, you know, when Sterl climbed up there to check that fire out, he sprained his ankle, hurt himself kind of bad. George says, yeah, he says, I suppose you guys are expecting a thank you. And I says, well, whatever. He says, well, he says, this is the way it is. He says, all the rest of the managers up and down the valley, their warehouses are burning down and they're getting new ones, and you guys saved mine, so I don't get a new one. I mean, he'd come over and say something, and it was yes, sir, no, sir. You know, I mean, you didn't question him. If he wanted something and you wanted to do it, that's the way it was. Or I mean, I felt that's the way it was. But after you got to know him, I mean, he's a great person. Yeah. Well, there's tons of them, but I think he played a really good trick on me one time. Friday and Saturday nights in the store up there used to be pretty wild when all the bars were open and everything. And I had a gal that worked there, Rhonda, that was really good. She could pretty much handle the crowd. Well, one night it's pretty chaotic up there, and apparently a guy and a gal went into the women's restroom, and have you heard this?
No, keep going.
Anyway, a guy and a gal went into the women's restroom, and apparently were getting it on the sink. Well, the sink broke off the wall and hit the floor, and they come running out of the bathroom, and the gal gets away, but Rhonda caught the guy because he couldn't get his pants up his legs fast enough, and called the police and everything. But anyway, that episode happened. That was a Friday or Saturday night. Well, Monday morning I open up the shop, and the first guy that comes through the door is the Mike Thurber, the police chief of police. And he's got this manila envelope from Okanagan County District Court and legal papers inside of it. And at the top of the legal papers is some law office from Seattle. And so this guy that Rhonda stopped is suing me. And he's suing me for a multitude of things, damage to personal parts and all kinds of stuff. And I mean, the more I read this, the madder, I'm getting so mad I'm shaking. And Thurber, he just standing there. So I'm so mad, I'm going to the phone to pick it up and call this law office and give them a piece of my mind, you know. Well, about the time I get the phone, Thurber puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, I think you can stop. He says, a friend of yours is pulling a funny on you. Well, George did. I think Shan, but it was all legal papers, and you know, it looked for real. So there was a lot of things like that we had a lot of fun doing. He was telling about going to Chelan the first, I think it was the first day the water grade highway had opened or something like that. But anyway, he was going a little fast and ended up, I think, turning the car on its top or on its side, and he said the flagman didn't think much of me when I went by him all upside down in the car. So.
A lot of lessons about some of the things that he was interested in, and I was too. We're similar in our backgrounds, so a lot of things he taught me, and I taught him a few. So he taught me about watching cost. He was good at costing things. I was more free with money than he was, and so that was one of the things that he taught me. I don't know. I don't know that I taught him anything now that I think about it. I thought I could teach him something about women, but that wasn't something I went into. So
I remember our conversations, and I remember thinking after those conversations what George was really trying to tell me. Like the box cost example, what he was really telling me is that to be good at what I was doing, I had to be diligent every day, looking at all of the details and paying attention to them and striving to get better every day. So he never had like a saying had told me like get better every day, but when he talked to me, I could tell he was passing on knowledge that he wanted me to have without directly saying do this or do that. And he's been really beneficial, and I've enjoyed doing what I do. I liked running into him. George, I liked running into you in the parking lot at the grocery store, and I know I startled you a few times when I'd run up to the window and tap, and you'd look over like, what the heck? But I always appreciated George. You always gave me time, and you'd roll the window down, and we'd just sit there and talk, and you'd let me ask the questions that I had on my mind, and you were always very free with the passing of knowledge, and I appreciated that.
I always try a little harder because I know he's watching, and make I always try to put my best foot forward every day and try to give it a little extra effort. Because I know he's gonna be watching, seeing what I'm doing, and I ask him sometimes, what do you think, you know? And he's always honest. I always appreciate that. I said, what do you think about what we're doing over there? And he said, well, might be a little bit of over farming going on over there, you know? You might probably, you know, by doing a little too much. But I always appreciated that because he was always honest with me. If he thought, you know, something was right or wrong, he wasn't afraid to tell me. And that was good. He's overcome a lot of things. A lot of things. I can remember when he had his accident. And if you know, but you listen to the way he couldn't reach his phone, so he had to strip the laces on his jeans with his thumbnail to get his pocket, to get to his phone in his pocket. I mean, most people would have just gave up, not even tried, but not George. Yeah, I always used to be afraid of him because I thought, oh man, he does. You know, I watched him just like he watches me, I think, and thought, geez, I don't see a lot of people going up to his house ever. You know, I see the field man stop and visit down at the orchard or Bob Foyle, but I didn't. Dan Hunter, I guess, but I didn't. So I was always nervous, you know, but he's not that way at all. I found out, definitely. Yeah, I really appreciate he's given me a chance to plant some cherries down there. It's gonna be fun.
Kind of set me up as far as managing money. You always had some good ideas on, you know, setting up a budget sheet and managing money. Always had some good ideas about, you know, I wasn't a real businessman, but you kind of directed me in ways that made sense and how to set things up, and I remember that. You're a lot smart. You're a smart man.
I hate to say this, but he's one of the smartest people I've ever met. But on the other hand, I've been good to him because I listened to all his boring stories 2 or 3 times over and pretended I hadn't heard them before. But no, George is one of a kind, and I feel very fortunate to call him a friend.
He told me that you have to figure out how to handle your issues and push through them and move on with life, because nothing's going to stop for you. You have to get what you need done no matter what.
The first thing that always sticks out of my mind, and it may seem insignificant, but I remember it all the time, is one time George and I were eating lunch at the restaurant in Pateros, and we were talking about how, you know, it's hard to work a full-time job and have a wife and have kids, and, you know, where do you put your effort? And he looked at me and he said, you know, Eric, it's good for a person to have pressure against them. It gets them to reach their ability. And I always remember that. I think about that often, and I actually repeat it. You know, with pressure against you, you find out what you're made of. You can rise, and that's what he meant that day. And I always remember that.
Yeah, in those days he told me we're going to sign all the checks in red ink until you can pay all your bills on time. And every day we had to go into George and we decided together what bills we were going to pay, and he signed every check in red ink. And that was a lifelong lesson there. I mean, you learn from that.
You know, I mean, so much of, you know, my business acumen, I learned from him. So I don't have one thing that really sticks with me because it's such a big part of me. So there's really not one thing. You know, George had a very, very simplistic way of looking at finances. And because, you know, if you don't know what you're doing, it can be pretty complicated. But he had a very easy way of looking at it to make it to where, you know, most people could understand it. And so I was like that because he always had to dumb it down for me, you know. Well, that was the thing about you know, working with George and understanding George is that, you know, we would do a lot of things around the warehouse to make a few pennies, right? I mean, the margins are pretty thin, and he taught us, you know, how to look at all the different angles. And you know, one of the things that you know, that I picked up from George, and I've said it 1,000 times since then, and that is, you know, the fruit return and how you look at warehousing is really boiled down to 3 things. And it's yield, it's packing cost, and it's the FOB. I mean, I've had people from other companies call me and say, you know, how are you doing this or how are you doing that? And I go, very simple. There's only 3 places to look: yield, packing cost, and FOB. And that was one of the principles that George drove into me, and the things that, you know, we focused on and we've been successful doing because we focus on those things, because those 3 things drive the grower return. And see, George, I didn't forget.
Go to work, sit around. I've watched many, many times over the last few years since he retired from Magi. In the morning, it'd be dark, and I see his pickup come off the hill. I go, oh, it's time to go to work. George is going to work. No, he just worked hard at what he did, and it was just his way of life. I mean, he did it when your mom and your uncle were little. He worked 2 jobs, went to school, you know, didn't have a pot to piss in early life. Then built the fruit stand up down there, which was what, he really enjoyed that. He liked that. But I think he enjoyed Magi too. My grandfather hired him, and I think some of the growers thought he's crazy. He hired this 28-year-old guy, or 28, I think he's 28, that had no experience in that kind of job. But he had enough gumption to dive in and make it work, and did. I'll tell you what I learned from George. One thing I learned from George is that you know, work ethic. He had a work ethic probably to a fault for himself, because he was Magi, and he ran it like it was his own personal outfit, and that's why it was successful. Probably the most successful co-op in the state. We had the cheapest packing charges. You know, George, if somebody wanted to spend a dime, he let them spend a penny. But he made it work and made the growers a lot of money. So that was his big claim to fame, I feel, is just his intelligence running the warehouse, keeping costs down, getting money back to growers, and that's the whole name of the game in this business. But George, his honesty, his integrity, and hard work, along with his, he's going to see this, right?
Yeah.
He's kind of smart, but I hate to give him too much damn credit. Well, kind of. Yeah, let's just put it kind of smart. Oh, he's given me a lot of advice. A lot of advice over the years. He's had a lot of experiences. I don't remember much about my grandfather, other than my grandfather was kind of a guy that he was perceptive on people. Maybe not the work that he did himself, but he knew how to find good people. And Dad and George would bounce things off each other and spend a lot of time together. Dad was the chairman of the board for a long time, but even more than that, he was a good friend of George's. And George is really a cat, because cats have 9 lives, right? Now, he hasn't used them all up yet. He's maybe used 7 of them. The first 5 or 6 were pretty tough. I mean, mower cutting him up, tractor running over him, and various other things that a lot of people wouldn't have survived. George survived, so I think he can beat this thing's going on now too. He's going to be around for a while longer. We're going to have to put up with that little fart for a while. I hope so, because I enjoyed our talks.
Yeah.
I really enjoy going over and having coffee with him.
I think every time I was around him, I learned something. I was I was fortunate enough to be across the street from him for over 30 years, and especially when we built the new convenience store and stuff, he would kind of use our place sometimes to come over, have a cup of coffee, and get away from things. And we had many talks. And I was the listener, of course. Every time you were around George, if you kept your mouth shut and your ears open, you learned something. We often talked about everything: business, family, investing, stupid people, smart people. Another little humor story, I can remember many times we'd talk about vacations or something like that, but we'd talk about, he had some growers that had big motorhomes and stuff, and we both thought they were crazy for the expense and all that stuff. So you get the last laugh, George, because I got one sitting in the driveway now. And they're not very cost effective, but they are fun.
Oh, on the fruit industry? Oh, I mean, George had a reputation of being a very, very tight manager and a very successful manager. I mean, you brought up, you built that company from basically nothing, and you did it with a lot of hard work and a lot of long hours. I know. I saw you there a lot, and whenever I'd go out to some of these meetings, you know, it was, well, George runs a tight operation, and it shows because of the success that you've had. That was very well known out there, all over the whole industry knew that.
Because of George, I think I've always been interested in the apple business, that side of agriculture, and I am to this day because you know, part of my family, my grandsons are in it. I think there was a period of time when your grandfather was probably the smartest mind in the apple business, maybe in the world. And I truly believe that. Yeah, it's, I've often encouraged him to write a book. I think he probably wasn't the first, but he was one of the pioneers in the merging of warehouses and stuff. He's got great stories that I hope he tells you kids about his negotiations, saving Treetop, and who knows what else he saved, you know. But a pretty great man. He did things that changed the industry, and in a lot of ways got it to where it is today, and in a lot of ways kept a lot of people going. I mean, we all know of some of them, but we don't know of the ones that he didn't tell us about, you know. And I've talked, like I say, I'm interested in the industry, always have been, probably because of him. And you know, there was a lot of years that he, people would, they didn't understand him. You know, they might meet him in the post office or somewhere, and he wouldn't even look up. You know, well, I seen George today, he didn't say hi, you know, that's the way he is. Well, I truly believe it was because he had so many things on his mind and going on that it wasn't that it wasn't important to him, but to say hi or something, but that wasn't in his makeup at the time. I mean, there was too much other stuff going on. And another thing he did, you know, with employees over there at Magi, I know a lot of them that he helped. You know, I mean, he loaned them money, he gave guys jobs and kept them working that, you know, shouldn't have, you know, and a lot of things like that. The one that fascinates me is the treetop deal, and I don't know if we talked about that or not, but he got into the negotiation of it a little bit, and I mean, Treetop was going under, you know, and he was president of the board or whatever, and he flew back to Chicago, I think it was, to negotiate with the people that were going to buy it, which he told me was Foremost Dairy. And since then they went under. But anyway, he said he went back there and he had a certain, I don't remember what the dollar amount was that he needed. And he said he walks into the meeting and they offered him more than that before they even started. So he had that part of it won, so he ups the ante. And every time they would question him about something, he'd say, well, I got to go call my board and talk to them about it. And he said he'd just go get in the elevator and go down a couple floors and smoke 3 or 4 cigarettes and go back up and start again and never call anybody. So the merging the different warehouses and stuff like that, because it was a time when the small ones weren't going to survive, you know, and I think in the valley there was probably a few that got together, but he was the one that really started that process or moved it to the point where it got.
Well, before I was even involved in the industry, I knew that if somebody had an issue, and so even very big companies had an issue, they would get a hold of George to help them solve our problems, bring us back to life. And that's an honor if you really think about it in the industry, that big companies that could be going under or close to going under, they looked to George for advice. And almost every time he helped them.
Oh my gosh, you know, I mean, I guess, you know, George was involved in so many ways. You know, he basically, you know, helped salvage the industry during the Allard meltdown. You know, I mean, George was instrumental in that back in DC and doing all the things he did. He probably saved Treetop, you know, from a train wreck. So I think those two things are huge. But I think, you know, besides that, just, you know, people that I talk to even today that are, you know, my age or a little bit older, they're like, you know, oh, George, yeah, he was a good operator. He was sharp, you know, and everyone always, you know, respected George. They may not like him, you know, some people didn't like him, but they respected him because he was so sharp, and they couldn't argue with that, right? And so, well respected from his employees all the way through the industry.
I think George always had a very good sense of value versus cost. And I think he made a lot of guys a lot of money putting the right fruit in the right market, or helping advise guys, you know, how to deal with their crops, because he was such a numbers guy, and he knew the marketing side so well and the packing side that he would take the the wrong fruit for a market or a pack, and you know, make a mistake with it that ended up costing guys money. And he's honest. He would be honest. I mean, I know he'd be honest with guys on whether or not to pick or not. I can remember one story he told me when he had nectarine. I'm sure it was nectarines. He had some here, and there was they didn't have a lot, but they had some in the program at Magi, and he said they shipped them, packed them and shipped them, and they called and said these nectarines, we got some decay in here, and we want to reduce the price on what we're willing to pay. And George said, well, wait a minute here. And he said, I'll tell you what, I'll be there in the morning. So he went and caught a plane, flew down, and spent all day going through boxes of nectarines. And he was able to track that down to one lot of all the lots that they had packed. He was able to track it down to one lot. And then he went to the buyer and said, okay, we can make an adjustment on this lot, which happened to be a very small percentage of the order. And then the rest of the nectarines sold at that much higher price that he had agreed upon. But it's just things like that most guys wouldn't make the effort at all to do something like that, especially nowadays. They would just say, well, okay, no big deal. But that's, I mean, he put all of his effort into what he was doing and made everybody a lot of money because of that. Well, and he told me one time, I can't remember how long after he'd been hired to run Magi, but he said that they came to him and said, hey, we don't want you to have your own orchard as well. Kind of a conflict of interest. And George said, well, you don't pay me enough money to dictate that to me, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that too. And obviously they didn't let him go, so I thought that was, you know, it takes guts to do something like that, you know. I mean, most people would be, you know, wouldn't have the guts to do that. But he didn't have it easy either. I think a lot of people see George as, you know, a really wealthy guy that, you know, has always been wealthy, but you know, no one really knows him very well. But he told me a lot of stories where he'd come home on leave from the military and he'd hitchhike back to Brewster, you know, from Seattle, and worked and put himself through college. You know, he told me he loved working at Cranes, inspecting fruit, because they always worked a lot of overtime. So he could make quite a bit extra money that would really help him get through the next stretch of college. And yeah, I don't know I ever heard of George say he did anything easy, which I think explains why he's such a hard worker.
He's been doing it forever. So you could ask many different people and get a lot of different answers, which shows the breadth that he touched it. In my experience, I would say the most impactful things he did were making us as a family better managers. And personally, I know what he did at Treetop. So those are two things that I got personal experience of George and his impact, helping us. And then when I became a board member at Treetop, it was actually my dad told me. I was like, Dad, they want me to be this board member. I'm not really sure, you know, I don't know anything about Treetop. And he said, well, go talk to George. George knows all there is to know about Treetop. And so I went over there and said, George, I'm thinking about becoming this board member. He said it'd be a good idea. It's a great board. You're going to learn a lot, and you'll bring a good perspective. And I said, well, tell me what perspective I should bring, George. So he told me, George, you told me what I ought to do there, and I wrote it down, and I went and I did it. And Treetop's doing good, George. We're actually in another CEO transition. Remember when I came and talked to you about the last CEO transition, and the performance wasn't very good. We had a talk there at your house, and you gave me some ideas on what to do. Well, we're in another CEO transition. This time the company's doing really well. Tom Herson is retiring. You probably know Tom. He was in sales for like 30 years and been CEO for a couple. And he's really got the operation running well. And the new CEO is going to be Craig Green, our CFO currently. And he's a good guy, and he's going to pick right up where Tom left off. And so George had a big impact on the industry through Treetop, and he's also helped me in my venture, in my road with Treetop. Well, I think there was actually a time where he had to fire the CEO and go down and run it.
Treetop was broke, he turned it on.
Yeah, he told me all about that too. He just said it wasn't going right, and he was chair of the board, and I'll probably get some of the details wrong, but he knew that he needed to make a change. I don't think he went through all of the correct avenues and getting permissions and whatnot. I think he just said, we're going the wrong way, and that guy's the wrong guy. And he fired him and ran it himself until he found the right guy, and probably saved the company, actually, much like ours.
Oh, that's a big one. Impact on the fruit industry. Well, George, in the northern district from Wenatchee North, George was kind of the founder of the fruit industry we still deal with today. George took it from an era where we only had refrigerated cooling. Well, he began before that. He started with no cooling, went to refrigeration, which could extend our sales season a long way. And he went from refrigeration era to the CA era, where we went from being only able to sell fruit for a few months a year to now where we can store fruit for over a year, and apples are a commodity in the store 12 months out of the year. And all of that happened under George's watch. You know, the co-op deal that he had with Magi was strong. Co-ops have probably, I would think, suffered a little bit in recent years. And I just hear through the industry, without ever telling people that I know who George Chapman is, well, if we had guys like Chapman around these days, it'd still be working all right. You know, so I think what he's done to the fruit industry is, kind of beyond measure, really. He is responsible, him and, other people in his generation, but for building the fruit industry that we're still working in today. Real pioneers of the industry, to be honest.
These kids don't understand that while you were running Magi, you consolidated all the warehouses in the Okanagan Valley into one warehouse, plus Manalapateras, and that was pretty imperative, between O&O and Caribou and the various Star Crisp and Manalapateras and whatever, and kept one of the biggest co-ops in the state together, other than you and Trout, and maybe one in Yakima. They're just darn near none of them left now. They don't run them like you did. Anyway, I'd like to thank you for helping our family basically save our company and getting it turned around, and let me flag you down in the Texaco parking lot and ask you how you thought the world apple market was going to work in various crop sizes, and what you thought with your experience and what I thought, and I just kind of feel you out, see what you thought was really going to happen. In our company, I don't know if Dan Tarbert still sends you the financial data and stuff. I know he did for a long time, but we're actually kind of semi-refinanced and, operating in a positive cash flow. I know that probably fascinates you. That we're gonna have to teach some accountants how to do actually some tax accounting instead of loss accounting for once. Thought you might like that.
Second to none. I mean, he ran Magi like it was his own company. Basically it was. And as a co-op, that's not the way it's supposed to be, you know. But he ran it like it was his own, and they were very successful. He set the role model for other managers. Unfortunately, not too many people have followed suit in that thing of you know, tracking costs and watching costs. And anymore, it seems like businesses are just worried about selling for whatever they can get, but not watching the costs. But yeah, nobody's had more of an impact on the industry than George.
He was a giant in our industry. I mean, he was on that treetop board. He ran the co-op for so many years, and it was a very successful group. He had a great group of growers. He knew how to manage the growers. He knew how to manage the customers. And, you know, being neighbors to the co-op for so many years, I mean, you know, a quarter, half a mile separated us. We had a ton of respect for George, and he did a wonderful job, and he's a giant in our industry, in my opinion.
Oh, I think his impact has been tremendous. I mean, he saved Treetop. He had Magi at the top of the game. You know, that's huge, because a lot of people weren't in favor of Treetop. You know, we want lots of money for our cull apples. Well, Treetop kept us from dumping our apples in the canyons and made money for the growers at that. That was a real struggle for him, I know, because some of the directors in Treetop were more concerned about themselves than Treetop. And George had been a mentor to a lot of other warehouse managers up and down the valley. You know, look what BHP did. They hired George out of retirement to save their company. That says quite a bit. And to work with just one family who everyone in the family has a strong opinion because it's theirs, and he had to tell them no on a lot of things. But they respected George enough to go with his ideas, and Gibber's Farms is, you know, as they turned it around and have grown tremendously since. So I give him a lot of credit for that. And I'm sure they do too.
Yeah, George, I want you to know, as a professional, that in my field, that I really looked up to you. I wish I had more time with you. You know, you had left the receivership role and went to the board by the time I came in, and man, I wish I could have worked for you, really watch you in action. But I admired you. You were a role model. You were somebody I could go to when I had questions, and I always knew I could trust your answer. And then as we had these interactions, you became a good friend. And a couple of times I just drove over to your house and sat with you, and you were always polite and kind and honest, and you know, nobody probably knows that actually, that I ever went over to your house and sat and talked with you. And so, George, I want you to know that you meant a lot as a friend, as a mentor, and I love you a lot, George.
George, I really enjoyed the time we spent, you know, in 17 and 18 when I spent a couple of years helping you in the orchard, getting to know you a little bit more, not as Grandpa Tad or Dad's friend, but as my own friend. You know, you go through life and you meet people that you wish you wouldn't have had to spend as much time with as you did with, and you meet other people that you wish you would have got more time with, and I don't suspect we'll spend a ton of time together from here on out. Everybody's doing their own things, and short of working for you, I don't see how we'll ever spend that kind of time together again. But those couple years I worked with you were very special to me. I remember them fondly. I learned all kinds of lessons from you. I always thought you were generous with your time and your life knowledge, and I really appreciated my time around you and the conversations we had. I guess another thing I would say to George, if he was right there at that camera, is that your grandkids called me wanting to put this together, and there's a ton of people around this area that know you and like you and that you've touched their lives, and you have people that care about you, and by my estimation, that's the greatest value, that's the greatest wealth anybody could have in life, and you've got it. And every once in a while, you know, people don't know that unless you tell them, and this is my attempt to tell you that.
He means the world to me. He has my whole period of time in the orchard business, and I think the world of him. I'm not sure about his politics, but we won't get into that.
George, I wish I'd have got to know you better 40, 50 years ago. It took a long time to actually get and visit with you, and it's been really rewarding to me. I enjoy your company, I enjoy your conversation, and I think you've done a lot of good for the area, and you have sure built yourself an interesting empire over the years from what you started with the fruit stand, and it's very interesting, and it can be done. And I'm glad to consider you as a friend.
Think a lot of you, George, and it's been a pleasure knowing you.
Well, George, you've been an inspiration to me and a teacher, and I'm a little sad that we don't get to do that anymore now that you don't have the orchard, but I appreciate what you taught me in the time we did have together, and I will use that knowledge for the rest of my life, so thank you.
Oh, George, I don't know, George. Well, since we had the same birthday, I have to be nice, but I don't really want to be. Thanks for being a good friend. It's been great. Let's keep it going. Many more years. Get well.
George, you know, I just want to thank you for encouraging Bob and being there for Bob. He loves you a lot. He may not say it to you, but I'm going to say it for him. When he thinks of you and is out in the orchard, he'll say, I wonder what George would do. And that's when I would say you need to give him a call and talk to him and ask him these questions, because he knows that you've always been honest with him, whether he wants to hear what you have to say or not. And I just want to thank you for that. And I also want to thank you for every time I see you, how welcome you made me feel when Bob and I got together. And I just know he loves you a lot. And I love watching your grandkids, and I like to talk with Val, and I just want you to know that everybody respects you and just loves you a lot, and we want you to just do the best you can at getting well and stay around and encouraging us and annoying us at times, you know. So I'm sure we all do that. So George, just thanks for being you, and thanks for giving your knowledge to everybody. The apple industry would not be where it is without you. So thanks for all of that.
Felt really bad to hear. I saw you driving around with your dog. Next day I knew you were really sick, and I just felt bad about it. I don't know what to say, George. I'm sorry about that. Just want you to know that we really appreciate all you did for us. Thanks.
Yeah, George, I just really look up to you and appreciate everything that you've done for the community and for all the people that you've helped along the way. You know, I mean, you'll be the only one probably that'll ever know how many, but appreciate you giving me the chance to plant some cherries down there and excited. It's going to be fun, and I still feel bad that I didn't answer the morning that last winter when you slipped up the house and Mike couldn't help you out. And I didn't hear my phone. I feel bad about that. But I hope to see you again someday. Tell my grandpa hello when you get there. I'm gonna miss you a lot. Every day.
Well, George obviously means a lot to me, but I think what I wanted to know is that he did a lot of good for a lot of people, right? He elevated a lot of people around him. And, you know, that's hard to do. Not everybody does it. I probably wouldn't be sitting here today if it wasn't for George. So, wind, I'm choked up here. But when I hear the word mentor, that's George. So anyway, he taught me a lot.
Well, that's tough, because I said a lot of this at his 80th birthday, and it gets a little bit emotional. He's a good friend. He mentored me at a time in my life and a time in our business's life that we needed some mentoring. And George, you stepped up, and you not only became a good friend, you taught me how to manage other people better. You taught me how to run our business. You were beneficial for Mac and I to be around. You're a valuable board member for 20 years. And I just can't ever really thank you enough, and you're really gonna be missed. Just gonna miss seeing you there at the Quickie Mart when we're getting gas and BSing for 20 minutes. I miss that probably the most, because I look forward to those days. I looked for your rig there because I knew we were going to have a good chat. Good luck, man. We're going to see you here in the future. It probably won't be that long, but we'll see you soon. Thanks, man.
I love you.
Well, I think he knows what I think of him. I would really, really like for you to at least write down or tell your family everything about everything you've done, because I think it's just so important to your family and to the industry. And other than that, man, we just, there's a lot of people care about you. We'll see you soon.
Is it on?
Yes.
And then you'll edit it?
Yeah, we.
So take one.
Yes.
going straight through, and no sleep was Memphis to Pateros hitchhiking. Took me 3 days, and I never slept at all. They gave us to change duty stations. They gave us, it was either 3 cents or 5 cents a mile, and we could buy a bus ticket or a train ticket, or put the money in our pocket and hitchhike. And that's what I did because I wanted the money. And I made good time. Except one night around Little Rock, Arkansas, I got stuck for a few hours there. And then I was in a dust storm in Guymon, Oklahoma. I was stuck a little bit there. But then I made really good time up through Denver and Cheyenne and into Idaho and to Umatilla and Pasco. And then I got stuck in Pasco. It took me a while to get a ride in Pasco. And I did pretty good, and this is in the winter, colder than hell. And I got to Cheyenne, and I had a hell of a time getting a ride from Cheyenne to Pateros. Of course, it was dark and there wasn't any traffic, but I remember standing there at the end of Cheyenne there, and God, it was cold. Funny a lady came along and gave me a ride to Pateros.
Yeah, it's good to have pressure against you.
That's
It's a Chapman quote. I'll remember that forever.
Noted.